Good evening. Thank you for joining. I'm Michael Tobin, President of the Wellesley Conservation Land Trust. We've got an exciting program for you this evening and on April 26th, followed by some walks. First, let me introduce to you the Wellesley Conservation Land Trust. We are a nonprofit land trust, 501c3, founded over 60 years ago. We own 10 sanctuaries in Wellesley and on bordering towns, totaling over 55 acres. 5 of those sanctuaries have trails. That includes the largest, Guernsey Sanctuary, has 25 acres and significant trails in it. The map here shows you where the locations of some of those trails are. We are an advocate for natural space protection in Wellesley, and we have many educational programs, and I'll be giving you a menu of many options coming up in the next few weeks. We have a number of publications that we put out, one of which is really the genesis of this Zoom conversation, and that was a publication put out in 1961 called the Geological Story of Wellesley by Catherine Fowler-Billings, and it was updated in 1984. Let me read to you the last paragraph in that preface. This is from 1961. It is the hope of the Wellesley Conservation, then called Council, that this booklet will be the first of several to describe nature in Wellesley. Wellesley's birds, plants, and animals could be subject for similar booklets, which might be published in years to come. Well, in 1961, they certainly probably weren't considering things like Zoom and the web. And in that time, we have published books like Walks in Wellesley, which you can get at Wellesley Books. Still very up to date. It was just revised 2 years ago. And Birds in Wellesley, which is out of print, but available. We are funded by memberships and donations only, and grants when we can get them, no taxpayer dollars. We partner very much with Wellesley's Natural Resource Commission and other organizations in town. We have an 11-member board of directors, and we do have one opening. So if you own a chainsaw or a pickup truck, or you just like to be out in nature and support it, please contact us. As I mentioned, we have a lot of events coming up. We will send out this via email in our email blast, and you will be finding them on our website over the coming weeks. Everything from part 2 of this talk on April 26th, our ever popular guided bird walks every Sunday in May. We have open gardens at Cronk's Rocky Woodland and more. So please follow us on Facebook. You'll see updates there, our website, Instagram, and Twitter. We are looking for volunteers to help out with some of the events, including some with children. So please let us know if you want to help us out on that. This webinar is being recorded and will last approximately an hour. Question and answer session will follow the presentation. Since you are all on mute during the presentation and afterwards, please put your questions into the chat function, which you can find at the bottom of your Zoom window. And we'll likely hold those towards the end and then have our speakers answer those. We'll send links to the slides, the recording of this presentation, and other key resources, all registrants within the next few days. This is part 1 of this talk. The history goes not only back to 1961, but then when some of our amateur geologists in town independently contacted me, wanted to get a copy of the book and see how they can get involved. Put the 3 of them together, and this is the result of that, a updated geological story of Wellesley. Tonight is on Surficial deposits, approximately from the Ice Age to present. And then part 2, we're going to be going back in time, 800 million years to the formation of Wellesley in its bedrock and up till approximately the Ice Ages. Our amateur geologist, Crowley, is a 26-year resident of Wellesley. During COVID, he researched and photographed every one of the geological sites in the book, in the original book. Elisa Fine has an MA in geography from the University of Colorado Boulder, and two young boys whom she hopes will grow up to love rocks and the outdoors as much as she does. And Mike Thonis is graduate of Earth Science from MIT, trustee of the Boston Museum of Science, and has previously been a trustee of the Geological Society of America Foundation. We do have a bit of a celebrity as well. Chris just recently was part of the team that won the spelling bee. So that's Chris on the left. And so you've got a great presentation in store for the following 2 evenings. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mike Thonis.
Thank you, Mike. Am I hearable?
You are.
All right, good. Thank you. Hello, everybody. I'm just going to do a quick overview. Let's as Mike pointed out, this is going to be about the surficial geology, you know, the veneer that's on top of the bedrock, and we'll do the bedrock on the 26th. There was some reasons to do it in that order, but I think it's easy to figure out. Let's go to the next slide. Well, I think we heard this. It's do I need to do this, Mike?
No. Press on.
All right, there we go. Okay. This is a chart that the Geological Society of America publishes like daily. It is the official chart showing you all. You can't really read it, and I would encourage you to go online and look at it. It's very easy to find online. Just put in geologic timescale, you'll get this one most likely. The GSA is the official keeper of the actual cutoffs for each of these geologic segments of time. And you probably have heard of a lot of these. The way this works is like a snake. It starts off, the oldest rocks or the oldest periods of time are down on the lower right in magenta or purple or whatever that is. And then it kind of snakes its way toward the upper left, which is the moment. The upper left is tonight's period of time that we're going to talk about. Just for context, the Earth is roughly 4.5 billion years. It's still contested, and that's the very beginning down there. I don't know if that's orange or magenta, whatever that is, and you can't really read it, but it's the Hadean. So you get the point. Hadean sounds just as it is. North America, the first piece of North America up in Canada began at 4 billion years. So that would be the that first dividing line. And it turns out actually the oldest thing on Earth, the oldest piece of crust or continent on Earth is in North America up in Canada. It's called the Acasta. Then you go to the top of the right-hand column. That's the Proterozoic, or more specifically, the very top is the Neoproterozoic, which means the most recent period of the Proterozoic. We used to call it all the Precambrian, but they now call it the Proterozoic. That's about, that ranges from 1 billion to 500 million years. A billion. It's around 1 billion to 500 million years. And a lot of what happened in Wellesley, and we'll see it on the 26th, happens in that period of time in the upper Proterozoic. Other things happen, as Mike mentioned, and then you get to the yellows over on the left-hand side, and that is the Holocene, which is the period of time we're in now, and the Pleistocene, which is the main period of time that accounts for everything we're going to talk about tonight. Meryl Streep, when she won an award after having not an Emmy Award after having not won one for a while, she said, "It's been ever since the Pleistocene that I've ever won anything." So I thought that was pretty clever of her, because the Pleistocene is the period starting about 2.6 million years ago up until about 11,000 years ago, and it's the period that is the topic of this meeting. So also, let me just say one last thing, and then we should go to the next slide. But the Pleistocene in Wellesley is all about evidence from the continental glaciation. It's silt, sand, gravel, scratch marks, It's all of those kinds of things. It's not that way everywhere in North America, but that is definitely the way it is here in Wellesley. Let's go to the next slide. And so starting at about 2.5 million years ago, Pleistocene is defined as 2.6 million years ago. So somewhere around there, seems like a long time ago, but it really wasn't that long ago when you think about the age of the Earth being 4.5 billion years. So 2.5 million years ago, a very strange thing started to happen, and no one really quite understands why. There's a lot of theories. But what happened is the temperatures everywhere in the globe, on average, the surface temperatures of the globe started to fall, and they ultimately fell to 10 degrees Fahrenheit lower than they are now. Now, 10 degrees Fahrenheit is a lot. Global warming up till now, since 1850, has been about 2 degrees. 2 degrees is a lot. 10 degrees down is a lot. And what happened is snow started to accumulate up in the Hudson Bay area, northern Canada. Snow began to accumulate faster than it could melt. So winter snow was bigger than summer melt. And the ice got thicker and thicker and thicker. And when ice gets thick, they say it's plastic. It actually oozes out like silly putty. It just oozes out. So here's a very, very important thing. The number one most important thing to remember is that ice, whether it be the kind that's in an alpine glacier or continental, like what you see in this picture, ice pushes forward. It pushes forward, but it melts backwards. So as it pushes forward, it picks up all kinds of rocks, loose or otherwise, grabs them and bulldozes them and carries them and conveys them southward, well, in all directions beyond the center. And then at some point, it melts back. And we'll talk about that in a few minutes when it started to melt back. But this is what sets the stage for why it is that Wellesley has so much silt, sand, and gravel. So I think I'm turning this over to Chris, right, Chris?
Yes. Thank you, Mike, and welcome Wellesley and beyond. I'm so excited to share pictures and stories about part one, the superficial aspects of geology that you can find in Wellesley. On behalf of Elisa and the Mikes, I'd like to thank our sponsors, and I'd like to thank all of you for taking time out of your busy schedules to let us share a passion and listen to us tonight. I always love the story about Louis Agassiz, who famously asked the question, why do landscapes from England to Croatia, from Boston to Oregon, look so much like Switzerland, and came up with the crazy explanation that Mike just shared with you, that there was once an ice age and glaciers had covered most of the northern hemisphere. And there's two parts of that story that always seem crazy to me. Obviously, walking through a town like Wellesley and imagining that it's covered with 1,000, 2,000, 5,000, 10,000 feet of ice is amazing. It takes a wild imagination. But what about that first part? That the question he was trying to answer was, why does somewhere like Wellesley look so much like Switzerland? And the reason is the items on this list. What he was looking at were drumlins and kettle holes, eskers and outwashed plains, global erratics. and he could find those things all over the globe, and that's what led to that theory. Now, over my COVID semi-confinement, as Mike mentioned, I went out and photographed all of these and discovered that it's hard to roll out of bed in Wellesley without tripping over evidence of a glacier. And hopefully by the end of my talk, you'll be able to recognize those too. The first thing I'm going to talk about is glacial striations and polishing. Now, Mike just mentioned that the most important thing to remember about glaciers, if you take nothing else from this talk, it's that glaciers flow, and they flow all the time, not just when they're advancing. So for that 2.5 million years that Wellesley was covered in glaciers, there was thousands of feet of ice for most of the time, occasional meltbacks, but flowing over the rock in Wellesley. And it was scraping off the dirt and it was scraping against the bedrock that was then exposed. And at the bottom of that glacier, thousands of feet high, there were bits of granite and rock that had been pulled off in Canada or elsewhere. And that hard rock could score the bedrock that had passed over. And that's what we see in Wellesley. Here's a picture of that great rock. If you have kids, they have probably climbed on this rock in Wellesley Square. This is the rock right in front of the post office, which makes a great playground, but it's also a great place to see striations in rock. And in this picture, they go from the bottom left to the top right, the scoring that you can see in the rock that came from the glaciers. And that scoring goes from northwest to southeast, which gives us our first clue as to the direction that the glacier must have been flowing through Wellesley. And as you'll see as I go on, there's lots of other signs that can tell us how that passed through. Here's a picture of bedrock from Cronk's Rocky Woodland on Crown Ridge Road. And there's plenty of exposed bedrock there. Some of it you can see glacial scoring clearly. Some of it you can't. As the rock rebounded, as the glacier finally melted and the rock lifted up, it expanded. Sometimes that made the rock crack immediately as it spread out. Other times ice or other weathering might score it. So you can't see striations on every rock or make it out clearly. But one thing you can almost always see is the polishing that the glacier did on all of the exposed bedrock. So it made that little scoring, but in addition to that, it knocked off every corner, every protuberance, everything that stuck out got knocked out, and we're left with lots of polished bedrock in Wellesley. This example is called Devil's Slide. It's a 20-foot high knob of diabase that had, sometime when it was long underground, this magma had welled up between an area of Dedham granite that you can see to the left in this side. And that diabase was then polished for millions of years, so smooth that it's become a piece of playground equipment for kids. When I was at the bottom of this diabase slide, I intended to take a video and jazz up this presentation with the video of me sliding down. Got way up high here and decided my better sense got the better of me. So you can see the picture. On the left-hand side, I've got a picture of the pink cliff that you can see. And that doesn't look as polished. That's because that cliff is facing south. And as the glacier passes over the rock, it smooths everything to the north and the east and west, but it plucks the rocks that are facing south. It plucks rocks off of the face. And so in Wellesley, if you see that kind of plain surface, it's likely that you're looking more to the south, and that's where the glacier actually pulls rocks off of the exposed bedrock. I love the polished curves of this piece of diabase that you can find in St. Mary's Cemetery. Just beautiful shapes left by that millions of years of polishing. Looks like a pillow. If we had a close-up of this, you can also see striations carved in there. Another classic shape that Louis Agassiz would have recognized from his study of glaciers in Switzerland is called the Roche Moutonnet. And that tends to have a very gradual curve from one side where the glacier is coming from. Again, this is facing north or northwest in Wellesley. And then it comes down to a very steep curve on the other side. And that's the side that the glacier was plucking rock away. And this is a great example on Royalston Road. About 25,000 years ago, that glacier finally began to melt. Temperatures began to rise. Unbelievable amount of water began to be released. It created many proglacial lakes and floods. So those are lakes which are temporary, but they can be temporary for 1,000 or 2,000 years or hundreds of years while the glacier is melting. And all of that ground up rock and gravel that Mike was talking about that had been carried like a conveyor belt from Canada to Massachusetts, from Massachusetts to points south while the glacier was further, it all began to drop in place wherever it was. It's like the game of musical chairs was over. Finally, about 14,000 years ago, the edge of that melting glacier began to melt back past Wellesley and leave tundra behind. And at that time, a proglacial lake formed here, covering a good part of Wellesley, Newton, Needham, Natick, a bunch of surrounding communities. And we'll talk about the evidence for that in a minute. And that lake lasted for hundreds and even more than 1,000 years. At that point, humans arrived. They'd come over on the land bridge and could have been hunting caribou in the region. This is a map of Wellesley showing sort of the major formations then and glacial deposits that were left behind. It was different in different parts of town. There were Lake Charles that I talked about. We'll show some pictures of that. Would be the flat sections of town, like Washington Street, Weston Road, and some of the neighborhoods between them. Drumlins form, large hills we'll talk about, and eskers, more sinuous deposits of gravel and rock, as well as till left over almost everywhere as it dropped out of the glacier over the entire area. Lake bed deposits. So we'll start with that. This one amazed me because I had never thought about it. Mike took me on a tour, and once you know that that's what it was, you can really picture it. This is a view on Elmwood, right near Bates School at the end of Elmwood. You can see how flat it is. That's the lake bed surface that turned to clay on the bottom and left a flat surface throughout Wellesley. And if you look further back in the picture, you see a crosswalk there that's bumped up, and that leads to another flat neighborhood, a terrace neighborhood at a different level. And there's flat terrace neighborhoods at these exact same elevations in Needham and Newton and Natick and surrounding communities. And that's how geologists know that they must all have been connected for them to form at the same rate. There's a great contrast as you approach Royalston Road, which is hilly exactly past this point. This is another shot looking straight at that Roche-Moutonnet that I had photographed before. And I wish I had had a passerby come sit at that wall at the base so you could have a sense of scale of this really magnificent rock. But in any case, this is right where the flat bed of Lake Charles begins to make contact with the exposed bedrock that's much higher. So this likely must have been a shore of Lake Charles at some point, at one point of its different elevations. And as Mike told me, this could have been a point that Indians could have fished at that point off of this rock into the edge of the water, or jumped if they were willing to jump into 33-degree water. Eskers. Eskers are actually my favorite glacial formation that's left behind. Eskers are sinuous paths that are 4 to 8 feet wide. They have very steep slopes that can be up 10, even 100 feet high, dropping off to either side. And I'm a runner. I've run through every street and trail in Wellesley, and I always thought maybe these were some crazy thing left over from the farming time. I don't know what, couldn't think of what could have formed it. Turned out the origin is cooler than I could have imagined. Eskers are actually riverbeds, essentially. It's where, when all that ice started to melt, it had to flow somewhere, and some of it flowed right off the top, and we'll talk about what happened with some of that. But a lot of it flowed underneath the glacier, and it would form a river. And just like a river, like you would see walking in Maine or New Hampshire, it would get rocks and cobbles and gravel and silt all at the bottom of it. And as that continued, and a glacier might stall for 10 years or 100 years in the same place, and this river would continue to run, that riverbed would grow up. But instead of changing the course, the ice walls of the glacier pin it in, and it runs in the same course for a really long time, building up this esker formation. And then when it finally melts down, you get this very cool kind of negative imprint of the river that once flowed there. Here's another great, very characteristic shot of an esker. This one is in the Wellesley woods. You can see how it makes a turn just like a normal river you would see today might. And you can also see all the different size rocks that are in there. So an esker, if you dig into it, you're going to find cobbles, you're going to find gravel, you're going to find all sorts of different shapes and sizes of rocks, mostly worn down rocks like these because they've been tumbled by the glacier and then with water running over it for a long time. Outwash plains. Now we talked about the river running through and how fast that must have been with all of that glacial melt pinned into a small tunnel. This is the opposite. An outwash plain is once the water has gotten to the edge of the glacier and it's flowing out across a wide open area, you get a very different mix of stuff that you can find. And in this case, by Morris's Pond, we see that it's all gravel and sand. And this is a picture of the town gravel and sand pit. So they actually come in here when they need it, or they did until not long ago, and can take a scoop of gravel. They can take sand and use it around town because it's been so sorted by the process of being washed out from the glacier, and then depending on how heavy the rock was, that would be how far it could be carried by the water that was running off. So you get a very sorted set of gravel. And now, quite a ways back, they dammed up some brooks to form Morris's Pond. Morris's Pond is an artificial pond that serves as a town reservoir, and it's a terrific place for a reservoir because it turns out that this gravel is also a terrific natural filtration system. So as the groundwater makes its way through, it arrives into our reservoir much cleaner than it otherwise would. Outwash plains also make for terrific landscaping. They're very fertile with the mixture of gravel and dust from the grinding of the glacier. So you've got a surface that's very easy to landscape, doesn't have those big rocks, and that's why it makes a great place for the country club to put a golf course. Hoyden Golf Course is also an outwash plain. The Wellesley College campus, a good part of it is an outwash plain. The fields around Schofield are an outwash plain. So a lot of areas that we've landscaped into some of our beautiful golf courses and parks were once outwash plains. Ice contact fronts. Now that water's pouring off the glacier, sometimes it gets a chance to spread out, like we just talked about for the outwash plains. Sometimes the glacier stops in place for a long time, and that gravel is pouring off the top, and it's got nowhere to go. It just builds up in a steep slope against the glacier. The glacier stays there for a long time. It keeps building and building, and then finally the temperature rises enough that the glacier retreats, and you're left with a characteristic, very steep hill. And the hill behind Paparazzi is one such. So that's an example of an ice contact front. There's a few of them in town. There's another one on the Indian Springs area, Kutchwitz Trail. I'm not sure exactly how to pronounce that, near Newton Lower Falls. And if you look at it, it looks almost like a one-legged or a one-sided esker. So you've got one side that's just got that characteristic steep slope. It's made up lots of the same gravel that you would see there, but then the other side carries off into an outwash plain or some other kind of structure. Drumlins. Drumlins, if Louis Agassiz was trying to find drumlins, and he would have known that drumlins are one of the structures that you find as a glacier retreats, he would have had to go out with surveying tools and tried to identify where are there some oval hills in Wellesley, which is the the shape that is left behind when that great bulldozer that Mike talked about at the top, that enormous glacier stops. These are great piles of till that are stopped in place, and they have a characteristic oval shape. These days, we could just Google contour map of Wellesley, which is what I did to get this picture. And you can see these ovals all in a line, all lining up with the score marks that we saw, with the direction of the roche moutonnées. So again, all of this evidence reinforcing itself that not only are these structures you would expect to see from a glacier, but they all kind of are in the exact same position you would expect to see. And these are big. These are not little items. The Babson is built on a drumlin. Maugus Hill is a drumlin. The hill behind Dana Hall is a drumlin. So these are very large structures made up of glacial till. Now, if you want to prove that it's a drumlin, you have to go see, maybe it's bedrock that happens to be in that same shape. And that could trick you. If you're a crazy person like me, then you can go out during a rainstorm to a part of Maugus Hill that's unvegetated, if that's a word, and you can see that the rain is, with the exposed surface, releases till down. And so I went out to the parking lot behind Quebrada, which has a very steep section of Maugus Hill that's not covered by grass or any other vegetation, and looked at it after the rainstorm, and you can see all of the gravel and stone being released as the water washes dirt away. Babson Hill, as I said, is a drumlin. I have to take geologist's word for this one. Couldn't check that. I did stop by the hill behind Dana Hall when they were putting a new house in, digging a foundation, and walked up to the guys who were putting it in and said, what's it like? What's the ground like? And they said, this is a dream. They had just come from putting a house in on Cliff Road, said it was dynamite and jackhammers and took forever to get the house where the architect wanted it. And they thought they were going to be there 2 days and they'd have this whole foundation in place in the Dana Hall area. Kettles. Kettle holes are really neat. If you see a circular depression anywhere in Wellesley, and they're all over, it's probably the result of a kettle hole. A kettle forms when a big block of ice gets separated from the glacier. The glacier melts back, the big block of ice does not. It begins to sink into the mud. The glacier is still pouring off all that gravel and till that we talked about. It gets on top of it. So that builds up around it, but not where the big block of ice is. Eventually that block of ice melts and you get left with this hole. And to be honest, that explanation always seemed kind of sketchy to me. Because why is this one block of ice not melting? Could there be some other reason that this forms in this way? And I read a really neat piece of confirming evidence for that. There were some people recently doing a soil study near the edge of an active glacier. They were coring the earth. They cored down 10, 20, 50, 100 years of soil they had examined, and then they hit ice because there was a giant block of ice that was still insulated by the soil that had been in there. And until that glacier retreats a bit farther, it's going to stay there. And that's at 100 years and counting. So it's not just a season that these blocks of ice might have lasted. They could last for a fabulously long time before they finally melt. And then whatever's on top of them collapses and forms a kettle hole. They're not all filled with water. So that all depends on the water level that ended up when the glacier receded. There's another great example of a kettle hole right next to that, right next to the gravel pit at Morris's Pond. That one's dry all year round. You can see the great bowl shape that it makes. Glacial erratics. I almost should have started here because this is where the whole story started with Louis Agassiz. He was looking at erratics on a mountain with another dude, and the guy said, you know what, these look just like the rocks that are in our village. And just like the white rocks that are in the village, down from ours, I bet this glacier that we're seeing leave the boulders right here was once big enough to go all the way down this mountain. And Louis Agassiz took that idea for about 2 years and said, I think he's right, but I think it's a lot more than that. That's why all these other boulders you can see around the world. We've got a great example of a moved rock made up of Roxbury pudding stone, which I think Mike will probably talk about how that pudding stone, this neat sedimentary rock with big cobbles in it, came to be back in Wellesley's history. But this one is interesting. It's called Problem Rock. The myth, at least that I've heard, is that it's called Problem Rock because the geology professors at Wellesley College used to give it as a problem set to their students to say, what is this? Is this something sticking out? Is this bedrock that's just sticking out of the ground because you can't see the bottom? Maybe it is. Is it an erratic that was carried here from far away, or is it a smashed pinnacle? Is it a piece of Roxbury cobblestone that was just knocked off somewhere very near to here, but not moved very far? I'm not going to give you the answer or my guess. Maybe if you go on the walks with us a bit later, we can take a walk by this and we'll all figure it out together. Here's another shot of that from the back, just showing those amazing cobbles in this sedimentary rock. There's another great glacial erratic in Kelly Field near Boulder Brook. This one has been named Fairy Rock. I don't know exactly where the town name came from, but I do know it looks like a giant throne that's just been dropped in the middle of the woods by this brook. It's also got a very cool diorite inclusion, a piece of green magma that penetrated this rock before it was broken off and dropped in Wellesley. River erosion. So now we're jumping forward again. It's 11,000 years ago, temperature stabilized. The land continues to rebound. The Charles River has carved its way through the till. It's now carving its way through rock. It becomes entrenched. Still occasional floods moving things around. Here's a shot of the Charles right by the intersection of Route 9 and 95 near Hemlock Gorge, where you can see it carving its way through the Roxbury pudding stone on either side. This is the meeting point of Newton, Wellesley, and Needham. At this shot, I made sure is all Wellesley territory. This is another shot that's all Wellesley, a little offshoot of the Charles, where you can see that steep slopes that this offshoot has carved through. And enterprising Wellesley residents, before there were refrigerators, built that dam so they could trap the water here and then carve this up and sell the ice to keep things fresh. The water also carved some really neat caves into the Roxbury pudding stone. The story I heard was that generations of Native Americans used this for camping and fishing. If you go there now, it does look like generations of Wellesley and Newton high school students have been there since then. And then finally, I'm gonna end my talk and then open it up to questions. I'm stopping on these spectacular meanders that you can see off the Wobbin Arches at the back of Nahoyden. And this was one of the last sites that I was able to find from that book, The Geological Story of Wellesley. And the reason it was so hard to find is because this change takes us smack dab up to today, because when you read the book, it says, look south of the Wobbin Arches and you're going to see the straight shot that the Fuller Brook takes to the Charles River. But in certain weather conditions, you might be able to make out some ancient meanders. And I looked and I couldn't find any straight shot that it was making to the Charles River. Finally, light dawns on Marblehead, and I realized that's because the meanders have reestablished themselves in the 60 years since the book was written. So with that, hopefully you will share my my understanding that the signs of the glaciers are all around us. notice it on all your walks through Wellesley. You'll see that glacial, that erratic, and recognize that it was dropped here by a glacier, or look at that hill and know where it came from. Thank you all for your time. I hope you will tune in to Mike in a couple of weeks when he gives his presentation, and you can find out how Wellesley has signs of earthquakes and continents colliding, and learn to see those too. Thank you very much.
Wow, fascinating, Chris. Really appreciate that. There's some drawings in the original book, but no photographs like you just showed here. So really appreciate it. Lots of good questions coming in, and I've got one as well. But before I do, I failed to mention up front at the beginning, I also want to thank my fellow board member, Bill Giesenhammer, who also was instrumental in coordinating and pulling this together. So thank you to Bill. And then also thank you to our co-sponsors for this, Wellesley Free Library and the Wellesley Natural Resources Commission. So let's get on to some questions. Why is it called Dedham granite? And at the same time, I'll just also add, I know there's Roxbury and all these terms of rock from our local towns. Who can answer that question? Oh, do I need to unmute you? All right, hold on. Go ahead, Mike. You can unmute yourself now.
There we go. Right. So, so geologic formations everywhere in the world are named after a place where the first description of that particular rock was made. So, if you go out to Colorado, there's the Mancos Shale. There's the Chinle Formation in Arizona, in Utah, the Navajo in Utah. Here in Boston, we've got ours. We've got the Dedham Formation. The question was about the Dedham. The first description of the Dedham Formation, which is all throughout, well, half of Wellesley. You'll learn more about this on the 26th, but the Dedham Formation was first described based on some outcrops in the 1800s, I think, 1890 or something like that, in Dedham, in the town of Dedham, Massachusetts. But that rock, the Dedham, is found all over the place in the Boston area. It is a huge formation, and we'll learn more about that later.
Great. Cynthia also asks, I grew up in Morse's Pond, which was man-made. Is that correct? And what is geologically significant about that area of town?
So I can take that one if you'd like. So it is man-made. There's a few things that are significant. Some people, I mean, there's a ton of things that are significant about it. There's the gravel that is there, which makes it such a great reservoir. The shape of the pond, even though it wasn't fully a pond before they dammed up the brooks that ran through it. It was marshy before then, but the entire shape, at least some geologists say, is another whole kettle pond. That it was a kettle hole that was not at that time filled with water, but they dammed it up and filled the kettle hole with water. So that's another kind of neat geological thing. You can also find some other, as we mentioned, there's other kettle holes in the woods, and there may be an esker. I'll have to think, but you can see lots of evidence of a glacier in those formations.
Odessa, go ahead, Mike. Hold on, let me.
I was just going to say that in Morse's Pond, Pickle Point, some people have said that's an esker, and I went over and actually looked at it, and it sure does. It's got all the same kind of rocks in it, Chris, that you described earlier.
And actually that was the one I meant to. That was what I was trying to bring to mind. Some geologists have said that's probably a crevasse filling, which looks just like an esker, and it may actually be an esker because people debate these kind of things all the time. But just like an esker forms on the bottom of a glacier, on the top of a glacier with all that water running off, when a crevasse forms, like you read about in the global, exploration, those can also fill with the same kind of rock and cobbles and everything. and form the same formation. So I meant to go by and try to judge for myself whether that's a crevasse or an esker, and I haven't done that yet.
Well, I'll put a plug in. Everyone can come explore Pickle Point, one at any time, but during Wellesley's wonderful weekend on Saturday at 1 p.m., bring your children and we will be building fairy and woodland troll houses using all natural building products that we find sticks and leaves. So it's a great annual event. So you'll be able to dig into the esker or make your own call on what it is. All right, Odessa asks, is it true that rocks were pounded into the dirt roads to make paved roads in town? Anyone here? We'll go to DPW, Odessa, for that question, and get in some other experts. Leanne asks, we live in the Fells area where there are a lot of streams that descend from Weston. What geology created that upland lowland topology? I had Mike, stop unmuting yourself, and I won't have to.
I don't know what's
there
going on. Okay, that is me. You're right. So the whole that whole area, Fells, as Chris described, starting at Bates School, Royalston Road, and then all the way to the Fells and beyond. I think there's a park down there. And there used to be a dog park, but I don't know what it is now. But that whole area is lake bed. What is characteristic of lake beds, they're very flat. And as the glacier sort of melted away toward the north, streams were forming and cutting across, going into that lake. But when the lake finally dried, there was this pre-existing network of tributaries. And all throughout the area, Fells, Bates, everywhere, you find all these little streams that all work their way ultimately down to the Charles. But there's a whole network, and it's a kind of giveaway that it's a lake bottom. It's just this, you look at it, you think to yourself, it must have been really flat here. We'll see some of that when we go on our walks.
Chris, maybe you want to stop sharing your screen or hit another slide, an overview, either one. Yeah, great. Why don't you leave that up? And I put these resources into the chat, and we'll be emailing them, and you'll find them on our website as well. Let's see. Cynthia asks, does a history of Morse's Pond area exist? I'm not aware of one. No one else here. All right, we're gonna ask a lifeline at another time, probably to the Wellesley Library, and see what they have. David and Emily, could you clarify whether the esker is the raised ridge with the rail on top or the valley next to it?
So the esker is the raised ridge, and a neat thing that I had in the talk before, but I cut out because I was way too long. Is in Wellesley, you almost always have a path on the top, which is a great place to run and walk, and you've got a path next to it at the bottom that follows the exact same pattern where that whole slope ends. So that whole slope is called the whole pile is called the esker, and you'll often find parallel paths. So if you find yourself walking on a path with a hill next to you, you might want to just run up to the top and see if you've been walking along the side of an esker.
Also,
but don't confuse.
The esker over at Longfellow is not one esker, which is the way it's typically described, but it's an entire rabbit warren of eskers. And I think it would be a great project for a high schooler doing a science project to go just get the right amount of, get the right topographic map or build one. And I think what we would see is that there's all these tributaries flowing into one main esker out of that area, but who knows? And we could also walk it and see.
And one last neat thing, which I also cut out of my talk, but I get to put things back in, is that Longfellow is another man-made pond in Wellesley, and it's actually between eskers. So there are eskers on there's a bunch of them in that rabbit warren you're just describing, but there's also one esker on the other side. So when they had those hills on both sides from the tributaries were there, they put a dam between them, and that's how we got Longfellow Pond.
Chris, so as you were describing an esker, we have lots of aqueducts, man-made aqueducts in town, which also could perhaps fool you to think it was an esker. So I guess dig down and see if you find yourself in a tunnel. All right, Leanne asks, how do you tell scoring striations from ice-created fissures?
Let's see. I'm not an expert. If Mike or Elisa.
So it's just a question of like, so the rock jointing. You showed a picture of the post office rock, Chris, where if you did look, I think I could see, I could see what looked like glacial striations, but there was also a lot of rock jointing. The orientation gives it away to some extent because the jointing can be in all different kinds of orientations, whereas the striations would be more north-south. Also, the jointing tends to be, weathering really gets into the joints and opens them up, and that doesn't happen with the striations. They're smoother for the reasons you described, Chris. Again, something we'll look at when we walk around. We can study a couple of cases and really develop a kind of our own instinct for the difference between joint patterns. And jointing happens, by the way, as Chris mentioned, because when the glacier melted away, 1 or 2 miles thick glacier melted away, the earth started to rebound from that weight. It still is. In New England, we're still rising. Here in Wellesley, we're still rising about 1 millimeter a year. Just because of the unloading of the glacier, 10,000 years ago. It's still happening.
Chris, if you go to the next slide, I think we previewed the dates for those walks.
Sure.
There we go.
Thank you.
I know the itineraries are a bit TBD, but those are the dates.
Great.
I want to just say one thing because it's important, but Elisa Fine did this beautiful PowerPoint presentation. And had it been left to me, Chris, I'm sure could have done a great job, but if it had been left to me, it would have been a disaster. So thank you, Elisa. And Elisa's going to be sharing the presentation with me on the Zoom presentation with me on the 26th.
Right. Let's see. I haven't seen a question yet on the kettle holes. I just want to make a comment. As you said, Chris, some kettle holes fill with water and some don't. And I think the number is we have 18 vernal pools, certified vernal pools in Wellesley. Don't quote me on that number. Maybe someone from the NRC, someone else can type it in there. But yeah, we've got great vernal pools in Wellesley, and you can see those on walks. We've got 2 that are in Guernsey Sanctuary, and many others. Oh, you showed the photo of the one on Turner Road and Weston Road that has the boardwalk out to it. That was built a few years ago, and Bill Giesenhammer as well led that building with many participants. So lots of great nature that has come out of those kettle holes. I'm going to tag on my question as well to Bill's question. His is my yard is which is largely flat and near wetlands. When planting trees, I find stones of various sizes up to football size and growing yellowish and more sandy the deeper you go. What feature is this? And then I'll ask a follow-on question.
I'd have to look at that, but it sounds a lot like the kind of soil that I grew up on out in the middle of Massachusetts, also a glacial outwash plain. I think that what happens is the soil at the top, it's got organic matter in it, and it turns dark brown. There's two prongs to this answer, but it turns dark brown, and as you go down, what was originally white sand, like beach sand, has been staining with iron staining. And so you see a lot of sort of reddish sand. It depends on where you are in Wellesley, because I've seen also places in Wellesley in the Bates area where excavating, you can see what it looks like. It looks like you're at the beach. It's so clean. But other places, I think that there is some iron staining. Iron staining is ubiquitous. It's the reason the rocks are so red out west. The other part of the answer to the question, though, is that the boulders through frost heaving every winter, summer, all the boulders are working their way up and ultimately to the top. So what was once a huge load of boulders from the glacier intermixed with the sand and gravel is getting released or sorted and released and driven upward by the frost heaving. I'm not exactly sure why that happens, but it seems to be what does happen.
And maybe that is part of my next question, which is stone fences in Wellesley and across New England, right? From colonial times, those have been built. What's the origin of those stones?
Exactly that. The stones were getting in the way of the farming. So they, first of all, you can't till the field with the stones there. But even so, farmers had to clear their fields of stones every year because they would be emerging. The field, the stone, there's a myth that the stones were used as boundary markers. That's not entirely true. Partly true, but a large part of the stones were designed to keep sheep from getting out. So they're only high enough to keep sheep out. They don't keep the foxes out or the foxes, you know what I mean, from getting in. But that's in New England, that was a problem for farmers. It's not a problem elsewhere in the country where there wasn't glaciation, like the southern half of Missouri, but the northern half of Missouri was glaciated, and stones are a problem there.
When the glaciers were retreating from melting, Arthur asks, what volumes of water were seen? Was it like many dripping faucets or many waterfalls?
Well, so the glaciers I've seen up alpine glaciers that I've seen, I've never been to Greenland. By the way, the continental glacier that covered us still exists. It's the one that covered, it's reduced down to the size of Greenland, but it's the one on Greenland. That's the same ice. Or the same body of ice. The water coming off of a melting glacier, and of course most of them are melting these days, is torrential. And one of the sources of water for the eskers, Chris, is a thing at the surface of the glacier, which is incredibly frightening, called a molan, a hole. And you'll be walking on the glaciers, and of course the glacier guides won't let you get near it, and you have to wear crampons. But there'll be these holes. Some of them are only a foot in diameter, but some of them are the size of a cathedral. And the water is pouring off the top of the glacier where the melting is occurring, because it's summertime, and the water is pouring down into this hole and makes its way to the bottom of the glacier. You do not want to fall in one of those because you'll end up at the bottom of the glacier. You'll end up at the esker that's being formed. And then if you go to the toe of the glacier, down, the southernmost or the lowest most toe of the glacier, the water there from that molan will be pouring out. I mean, it is, I said, what would it be like? It would be like all of the Charles River coming out of a tunnel, if you can imagine. It's huge. You cannot stand up in it. I'll put it that way.
Great. Thank you, Susan. Yes, history of Morse's Pond can be found on wesleymA.gov. Thank you. And I'll take a crack at this one, Bill, because I grew up on Long Island. I heard that Long Island in New York was the deposits from where the glacier met the ocean. My understanding, growing up on the South Fork of Long Island, is there were two glaciers that came down, and when the first one melted, that formed the South Fork, and the second one came down, that stopped and formed the North Fork on the east end of Long Island. But how about the experts?
This is right. This is right. The South Fork, I forget which one is Orient Point and which one's Montauk, but the southern point, the southern half of Long Island out to that fork, Southern Fork, I think lines up with Martha's Vineyard in Nantucket, and that represents the furthest south that the glacier got. And then the glacier melted back, and then it stopped again. And remember, it's a conveyor belt. So if it stops, that's called a still stand. There's other names for it, but it's a place where the rubble that's in the glacier is conveying down from New Hampshire and Canada and just dropping. And that formed the northern half of Long Island. I think Block Island, I have to look at a map, but I think Block Island, the little islands that are off of Falmouth, and the main chunk of Cape Cod is from that glacier. There was another lobe of the glaciers. You know, glaciers at their lowest point, their most southern point, are lobal. They're lobed. And there was another lobe that affected the outside of the Cape, but that's another story. It's not for now. It's not Wellesley, but it's complicated.
Excellent. All right. That will wrap it up for this evening. Chris, thank you very much for the photographs and the talk. I know you won't be joining us next week. Elisa, for putting together the presentation. Excellent. And so you and Mike will be leading the presentation in a week and a half from now, April 26th, 7 p.m. It'll be the same Zoom link. We have recorded this. We'll send out a link to this in a couple of days, along with the email with all the resources. They'll also be on our website, Wellesley Conservation Land Trust website, in the geology section and the resources page there over on the right-hand side. So you can continue learning all about the geology of Wellesley, and we'll see you on April 26th. Good night.
Right.